My name is Grace Palmer. I'm 32 years old, living in a sun-washed little house on the edge of Portland, Oregon. I work as a staff accountant for a mid-sized logistics firm, which sounds exactly as thrilling as it is. Most days I clock in, shuffle through endless spreadsheets, clock out, and come home to the same quiet neighborhood where golden retrievers nap on porches and kids zoom by on scooters. Until recently, if you'd asked me, I would have told you my life was solid. Not flashy, but content. Steady. I was married to Dylan Palmer, a project manager for a local construction company. He's 3 years older, with an easy laugh that once made my stomach flutter and shoulders relax all at once. If you met him, you'd probably think, what a great guy. Hell, I thought that for nearly a decade. We met at a 4th of July barbecue when I was 23, fresh out of college, still clutching a half-formed dream of becoming a travel writer. He offered me a craft beer and a crooked grin, and I handed over my heart like it was the easiest transaction in the world. For a long time, I believed he handled it carefully. Looking back, I wonder if I ever really knew him at all. That's the funny thing about trust, isn't it? It grows like ivy. You think it's beautiful, comforting, until one day you see it's strangled the bricks underneath. 3 weeks ago, I stood barefoot in my bathroom, clutching a cheap plastic stick with 2 unmistakable pink lines. After 3 long years of ovulation charts, quiet crying behind closed doors, half-whispered prayers over negative tests, I was finally pregnant. My hand shook so badly I nearly dropped the test in the sink. It felt like my entire chest cracked open. I pressed the test to my heart, closed my eyes, and imagined everything. The tiny baby growing inside me. The way Dylan's face would light up. The late nights rocking someone small to sleep. I saw it all. I wanted it all. I walked out into the hallway, dazed, as if the floor might shift beneath me. Sunlight poured through the living room windows, landing on our worn leather couch and the navy throw blanket Dylan's mom, Margaret, had knitted us last Christmas. The place smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and fresh air, ordinary, comforting. I wandered into the kitchen, where a pork tenderloin was slow roasting in apple cider and rosemary. I'd been prepping since morning. Today was Margaret's 60th birthday, and every inch of my house was dressed for the occasion. Peonies and hydrangeas, her favorites, sat in vases on the dining table. I'd set out her grandmother's china, polished until it caught the afternoon light like tiny mirrors. Sometimes I think the smallest details are what trick you into believing life is exactly as it should be. The clink of a fork against porcelain. The hush of soft jazz playing on the old Bluetooth speaker. The faint squeak of our screen door when Dylan comes home. I pictured the moment I'd tell him. Maybe after the candles were blown out and guests were gone, we'd pour ourselves glasses of Pinot, sit on the couch, and I'd slip the test into his hand. I could almost hear his laugh, see the tears gathering at the corners of his blue-gray eyes. He'd probably say something ridiculous like, "Let's go buy a tiny Mariners jersey tomorrow." God, I wanted that. I wanted his joy wrapped around mine so tight we couldn't tell whose heart was beating faster. Is it foolish to build your happiness around someone else's reaction? To measure your own worth in the curve of another person's smile? I used to think that was love. Now, I'm not so sure. Just then, I heard Dylan's truck pull up. The old Chevy Silverado rumbled to a stop in the driveway, tires crunching on gravel. My stomach flipped, adrenaline sparking. I shoved the pregnancy test into the pocket of my jeans like a kid hiding candy. A moment later, the front door opened and Dylan walked in, carrying a six-pack and whistling some country tune. His sandy hair was tousled from the breeze, and his button-down, soft green, the color that always made his eyes pop, was rolled up at the sleeves. He looked relaxed, pleased, entirely unburdened. "Hey, baby, you hiding in here?" he called. In the kitchen, I replied, too bright, too casual, my heart jackhammering against my ribs. He stepped in, surveyed the table, and let out a low whistle. "Damn, Grace, you went all out. Mom's gonna flip." "She deserves it," I said, smoothing the tablecloth that didn't actually need smoothing. 60 is kind of a big deal. Dylan came over, slid his arm around my waist, and pressed a kiss just behind my ear. It should have sent shivers down my spine. Maybe it did. But they were different shivers than the ones I remembered. He pulled back and smiled, that easy grin that once felt like safety. Not as big a deal as the secret you're keeping from me. I felt my cheeks warm. Later, when it's just us. You're killing me, woman, he laughed and nudged my hip. Before I could reply, the doorbell rang. The moment popped like a soap bubble. Dylan winked and went to answer it. Soon Margaret swept in, regal as ever, silver hair pinned into a perfect twist, navy suit crisp enough to shame my ironing board. She hugged me gently, commented on the flowers, the aroma, the place settings. Her husband George gave me a polite nod and a bottle of aged bourbon. Then the house filled with voices. Sarah, Dylan's older sister, arrived with her husband Eric and their 2 boys who immediately tore through the living room, shrieking with laughter. Old colleagues of Margaret's trickled in, chatting about gardening and bridge clubs. Someone turned up the volume on the speaker. Wine was poured, plates passed. I moved through it all, smiling, refilling glasses, answering the same breathless compliments about my cooking. I touched my stomach more than once, unconsciously, like I was telling the tiny being inside me, see? You're already surrounded by love. At least, that's what I believed then. But here's the truth that still knots my gut when I think about it. That evening was the last time I existed in the world I thought was mine. The last time I belonged to the story I'd spent years writing in my head. Because within hours, I'd overhear something that would gut every illusion I had. Tell me, have you ever built your entire life around someone, only to realize they were building their escape route behind your back? Stick around. I'll tell you exactly how my perfect little life unraveled, thread by careful thread. And by the end, maybe you'll understand why I say betrayal isn't a crack in the foundation, it's the whole damn house caving in. Before everything twisted into something I barely recognized, my life was simple in the ways I thought mattered most. I grew up in a small town just outside Bend, Oregon, where the summers smelled like pine sap and hot asphalt, and winters meant sled tracks crisscrossed our backyard until the grass gave up trying to grow. My parents, Susan and Robert, were the kind of couple who finished each other's sentences without meaning to. They'd been married 35 years by the time I left for college. I remember watching them slow dance in our tiny kitchen to a scratchy old blues record, flour dusting my dad's sweater because he'd been trying to bake bread, badly, for the 3rd time that month. They never seemed glamorous or grand, but they fit. Maybe that's why I was so hungry for that kind of fitting. I wanted a love that felt worn in, dependable, familiar like the faded quilt on my childhood bed. When I met Dylan, I was 24, just 2 years into my first real accounting job, renting a cramped apartment with a roommate who collected novelty salt shakers and left sticky notes everywhere. Dylan was 30 then, with a smudge of permanent tan on his arms from long days managing construction sites. His hair was that kind of sandy brown that always looked sun-kissed, no matter the season. We met at a friend's engagement party at a rooftop bar in downtown Portland. I was sipping a gin and tonic, pretending to be more sophisticated than I felt. He wandered over, holding a local IPA, and said something corny about the skyline being pretty but not half as pretty as the woman standing in front of it. I know. Sounds like a line that should make you roll your eyes. But it worked. Maybe because he didn't deliver it with the oily smugness most guys do. He looked nervous, like he'd surprised himself by saying it out loud. That honesty hooked me. Funny, isn't it? How we let tiny moments decide our whole futures. One awkward smile, one shared laugh over bad music, and suddenly your entire life has a new orbit. Dylan had a way of making the world tilt slightly toward him. He was patient in crowds, quick to help a stranger, the sort of man who'd pause to carry a stroller down subway stairs without needing a round of applause. In the beginning, that's all I saw. That's all I let myself see. A year later, we were married under a wooden arch draped in eucalyptus and ivory roses. The ceremony was held in the backyard of a local vineyard, with fairy lights strung between oak trees and my cousin fumbling her way through a guitar version of Can't Help Falling in Love. I wore a simple satin dress that cinched at the waist and flared out just enough to let me dance without tripping. I remember the way Dylan's eyes went soft when he first saw me, standing at the top of the aisle. I remember thinking, this is it. This is the real start of my forever. Do you ever look back at old photos and feel a sharp ache, not because you miss those moments, but because you envy how clueless you were? How completely you believed in the story you were writing. After the wedding, we settled into a rented duplex in the Alberta Arts District. It was noisy, wedged between a tattoo parlor and a vegan bakery, but it was ours. On Saturdays, we'd walk to the farmer's market, fingers laced together, buying bunches of zinnias and crates of peaches we couldn't finish before they bruised. At night, Dylan would flip on old action movies, and I'd fall asleep with my head on his lap, the faint scent of cedar from his skin sinking into my dreams. When we finally bought our house in the quieter stretch of southeast Portland, it felt like arriving. A two-story craftsman with a porch swing and creaky floorboards, surrounded by maples that set the whole street on fire every October. Dylan built me raised garden beds out back for tomatoes and sweet peas, even though he joked he couldn't keep a cactus alive. Margaret, his mother, visited often. She was a retired literature professor, always carrying a leather tote stuffed with half-finished crosswords and old New Yorker magazines. Her hair was clipped back in a smooth silver bob, her laugh low and knowing, as if she was perpetually amused by a joke no one else quite got. I liked her. Loved her, even, in the cautious way you love someone you hope will become family. She'd bring over lemon verbena from her garden, or hand me dog-eared novels with passages highlighted in yellow. She'd pat my cheek and tell me I was good for Dylan, which I chose to hear as approval, though now I wonder what she actually meant. Back then, life was gentle. We hosted low-key dinner parties, the kind where we dragged out mismatched chairs and let the dogs from next door wander in hoping for scraps. We talked about someday. Someday we'd travel to Spain. Someday we'd build a screened-in porch. Someday we'd fill the extra bedroom with a crib. I didn't realize how dangerous someday could be. How it was just a clever way to defer joy, to avoid asking harder questions. Because underneath that warm domestic glow, there were cracks I ignored. Little flinches when I reached for Dylan's hand at parties, or the way he sometimes came home smelling faintly of perfume I didn't wear. I chalked it up to stress, to long days, to my own paranoia. We want so badly to be right about the people we love. We'll explain away almost anything to keep that version of them intact. If you're still listening, if you've made it this far, I want you to remember something. The heart has a sneaky way of covering its own eyes. It wants to keep believing, even when belief starts to hurt. And soon, mine would hurt more than I thought possible. But I wasn't there yet. For the moment, I was still Grace Palmer, wife, daughter-in-law, neighbor who baked too many blueberry muffins, and blissfully ignorant of just how close my world was to caving in. It's almost funny how our memories pick and choose what to keep shiny. When I look back on those years with Dylan, I see a collage of Sunday mornings tangled in flannel sheets, our breath still warm with sleep, the quiet shuffle of him making coffee in the kitchen. I see him tapping the steering wheel in time with old Springsteen songs on road trips to Cannon Beach, his hair tousled by the wind through the half-open window. What I don't see right away are the late returns home that started creeping in, or the way he'd sometimes flinch when I brushed lint off his jacket, like my touch startled him. I told myself every marriage has seasons. Some colder than others. That's how I justified the moments that didn't add up. Like when I found a gold bobby pin wedged into the passenger seat of his truck. I never wore gold. Or when his phone lit up with a heart emoji from N. He told me it was Nicole from the vendor team, something about a joke from a company happy hour. Do you ever wonder how many little alarms your heart turns off just to keep the peace? I think mine disabled half its wiring before I even realized. Still, most days were comfortable. I'd pack us turkey pesto sandwiches in wax paper and we'd eat them on the porch after work, our knees brushing under the tiny mosaic table I found at a flea market. We spent quiet evenings watching cooking shows, mocking the overly serious judges while planning the elaborate dinners we never quite got around to making. Every so often, Dylan would pull me into his lap, bury his face in my neck, and whisper that I was the best thing that ever happened to him. I'd laugh, call him cheesy, then believe him all over again. Margaret, for her part, seemed genuinely fond of me. She'd drop by on Thursday afternoons with bundles of daffodils from her yard or a tin of lemon lavender shortbread that left our whole kitchen smelling like spring. We'd sit at the counter, nibbling cookies, while she shared stories from her decades teaching literature. She had this way of looking at me over her glasses that made me feel both seen and slightly inspected. At the time, I didn't mind. I wanted her approval so badly, probably more than I realized. Maybe I craved it because my own mother lived halfway across the state, and we'd grown more polite than close after my teen years. Margaret filled a kind of gentle, watchful gap. When her 60th birthday rolled around, I decided to go all out. I wanted it to be perfect, partly because she deserved it, partly because I think I was always trying to prove, maybe to her, maybe to myself, that I was the right woman for her son. I spent the entire morning arranging things. The dining table was covered in a pale green runner embroidered with tiny white leaves, plates set atop bamboo chargers, cloth napkins tied with twine and a sprig of rosemary tucked in each knot. A vanilla almond cake stood waiting under a glass dome on the buffet. Dylan moved through the house, hanging up guests' coats, topping off glasses of sparkling apple cider, flashing that easy grin that seemed to light up every room. Watching him laugh with his sister Sarah and joke with Margaret about turning the big 6-0, my heart felt like it was swelling. Isn't it strange how love can feel fullest right before it shatters? Almost like it wants to give you one last sweet taste before pulling the rug out from under you. At one point, I caught Dylan's eye from across the kitchen. He winked, raised his glass in a tiny salute. I smiled back, thinking, just a few more hours and I'll tell him. I'll place that little plastic test right into his palm, watch his face split open with wonder. I imagined us staying up late, sprawled on the couch, whispering about baby names. He once told me if we had a girl, he liked the name Nora. I preferred something a little old-fashioned, like Mabel or June. We'd probably disagree, then end up somewhere in the middle, laughing because it didn't matter. All that mattered was it would be ours. Guests began to settle in. Margaret perched on the arm of our love seat, holding a glass of Pinot Grigio, telling a story about the first class she ever taught at the university. Her hands fluttered as she talked, gold bracelets clinking, her voice dipping into hushed amusement. I leaned against the doorframe, soaking it all in. Sarah and Eric were in the corner, their kids playing a noisy game of tag around our coffee table, nearly knocking over a vase of tulips. George stood by the window, peering out as if checking the weather, though it was perfectly clear. It was one of those snapshots you don't realize is precious until later. 100 tiny normalities layered on top of each other. The hum of conversation. The faint drip of the kitchen faucet I kept meaning to fix. A tray of crab puffs cooling on the counter. Dylan's low laugh threading through the room. I thought, this is it. This is the life I was meant for. If you're listening, I wonder, have you ever been so sure of something, so deeply certain it was yours, that you didn't notice the small fractures forming right under your feet? Because that night, every soft, beautiful certainty was about to be pulled from me. I didn't know it yet. I still had a few hours left to live in that gentle lie. But soon, one careless moment would open a door I couldn't close again. And everything I thought I knew about love, loyalty, and who I was to Dylan, would unravel right in front of me. Stick with me. The next part, that's where the floor gives way. I don't think you ever forget the sound your heart makes when it breaks. It's not loud. Not some cinematic shatter. It's quiet, almost polite, like a sigh that realizes it's been holding on too long. The night Margaret turned 60 started like any other celebration we'd thrown. People drifted in with polite hugs and bottles of Pinot, coats piled on the entry bench. The kids ran loops through the downstairs hallway, shrieking so loudly it rattled the picture frames. In the kitchen, the pork tenderloin was resting under foil, soaking up its own juices, while the smell of thyme and roasted apples hung thick in the air. I kept fussing with little things that didn't need fixing. I adjusted the water glasses, twisted the dimmer switch on the dining room chandelier, wiped an imaginary smudge off the refrigerator door. Dylan teased me for being fidgety. He came up behind me, slid his hands around my waist, and rested his chin on my shoulder. "You're a marvel, Grace," he murmured. "Mom's gonna brag about this party for the next decade." I let myself lean back into him, just for a breath. I wanted to soak it up, that easy warmth that still felt like home. Later, after cake, 3 layers of vanilla almond with raspberry filling that I'd stayed up until midnight frosting the night before, Margaret settled into our armchair, hands folded primly in her lap, cheeks still flushed from the wine. "Where's Dylan gotten off to?" she asked, peering around the crowded living room. I was standing by the sideboard, pouring decaf into ceramic mugs decorated with tiny pine cones. I paused, scanning the clusters of guests, the swirl of conversation. I hadn't noticed he'd slipped away. "Oh," I said lightly, though my pulse gave a little jump. "Probably just stepped outside to call one of his guys. They're behind on permits for that big condo project." Sarah, always quick to smooth over awkward gaps, chimed in from across the room. "Maybe he ducked into his office. He still keeps all his plans and files crammed in there, right?" I nodded, forcing a smile. "Yeah, probably." But inside, something tensed. You know that sharp little nudge your gut gives you? The one you tell to hush because you'd rather keep believing? I felt it then. I excused myself, set down the carafe, and smoothed my hands over my blouse, light blue linen with tiny embroidered dots, a shirt I'd bought on clearance last spring and loved for how soft it felt on my skin. I didn't want to look anxious, even if my insides were quietly unspooling. I made my way down the hall. The door to Dylan's office was ajar, a wedge of lamplight cutting across the dark wood floor. I raised my hand to knock but stopped when I heard his voice. It was low, intimate in a way that made my stomach turn. "No, I know, baby, I hate it too," he said, followed by a small laugh that sounded almost shy. "But what do you want me to do? The whole damn house is packed. Her family's here. I can't just vanish." My hand hovered near the doorframe. I couldn't breathe. There was a pause. I pictured him pacing the rug, maybe raking a hand through his hair like he did when he was trying to soothe someone. "No, of course she doesn't suspect," he went on. His voice dropped even softer. "Grace trusts me completely. She'd believe me if I told her the moon was a porch light." Something inside me started to splinter. He gave another short laugh, then said, "I'll handle it soon. Few more weeks, let the birthday dust settle, you know? Then I'll tell her we've drifted apart, that it's nobody's fault, all the usual gentle bullshit." I staggered back a step. My shoulder hit the hallway wall. The gallery of mismatched frames rattled slightly, wedding photos, a silly picture of us in raincoats at the coast, a snapshot of Dylan holding my nephew on his shoulders. Inside my pocket, the pregnancy test I'd been carrying all day seemed to burn against my thigh. I pressed my hand over it as if I could will it to disappear. Back in the office, Dylan's voice had taken on a casual arrogance I didn't recognize. "She still thinks we're trying for a baby," he said, with a little scoff. "Hell, she's probably picking out names. Poor thing. She's sweet, just soft. Predictable. She'll cry, sure, maybe beg. But she'll let go." My throat closed. I couldn't stand there any longer. I pivoted, nearly stumbling over my own feet, and hurried down the hall to our bedroom. As soon as the door shut behind me, everything came loose. I pressed my hands to my face, trying to muffle the ugly, animal sob that tore out of me. I couldn't catch my breath. It felt like drowning while still above water. Is that how betrayal works? Quiet at first, then total. Like you're watching your life from outside a window you can't open. I slid down against the door until I was sitting on the floor, knees pulled tight to my chest. Tears streaked hot over my cheeks, and I didn't bother wiping them. I thought about how just an hour ago, I'd been daydreaming of telling Dylan he was going to be a dad. That maybe, finally, we were getting everything we ever hoped for. I pulled the test from my pocket. 2 pink lines stared back at me, oblivious, unfeeling. Proof of the future I was carrying alone. I wanted to smash it. Or hide it in the back of the closet and pretend none of this had ever happened. But instead, I sat there for a long time, clutching it in my fist, trying to understand how love could curdle so completely. Down the hall, the party was still humming. Laughter rose over the faint strains of the stereo, someone clinked a fork against a glass to make a toast. Life was carrying on, perfectly ignorant of the fact that my entire world had just caved in. And that, right there on the floor of my own bedroom, is where something in me finally snapped awake. Stick around, because what I did next would change everything. I must have stayed curled on that bedroom floor for close to 20 minutes, though it felt like no time and forever all at once. At some point I forced myself up, splashed cold water on my blotchy face in the bathroom, then leaned against the counter, gripping it so hard my knuckles turned pale. When I finally looked in the mirror, I barely recognized myself. My eyes were swollen, mascara smudged in ghostly crescents beneath them. My hair, usually twisted into a neat low bun for hosting, had come half undone, dark strands curling against my neck. I practiced a smile. It wobbled. Then again. Until it stuck, shaky but passable. That was the mask I put on as I walked back down the hallway toward the party, heart still thrashing in my chest like a trapped bird. Dylan was there in the living room, holding court near the fireplace with a small circle of guests. He was telling some ridiculous story about a contractor who accidentally sealed himself inside a crawlspace for 3 hours. The room burst out laughing at his punchline. Even Margaret's eyes crinkled with delight. For a moment, watching him from across the room, I felt completely removed from it all. Like I was staring at a diorama of someone else's happy life. He caught my eye then, and something flickered across his face. Concern, maybe, or just the instinct to check that his show was still playing to an approving audience. He stepped away from the group, brushing past me, and leaned in so close I could smell the leftover citrus from the IPA he'd been sipping. "You okay?" he murmured, giving my arm a gentle squeeze. I nodded. Lied straight through my fragile teeth. "Just tired. Long day." He bought it instantly. Smiled, pressed a soft kiss to my temple, then returned to his guests. Isn't it wild how easily some people accept the simplest lie, when it benefits them not to dig deeper? I moved through the rest of the evening on autopilot. Refilling drinks, handing out slices of cake that I couldn't even taste on my tongue. I laughed when the kids set off a mini Nerf war in the hallway, pretended to fuss at them for nearly knocking over Margaret's glass of Chardonnay. I complimented Sarah's new haircut, admired the delicate beaded bracelet Eric had given her for their anniversary. All the while, that ugly little voice in my head kept whispering, "He's leaving you. Not someday. Soon." Hours later, after the last hugs were exchanged, after Margaret clasped my hands and thanked me for making her birthday truly special, darling, after the door finally clicked shut behind Sarah's family, I just stood there in the empty foyer, staring at the pile of discarded party napkins and half-drunk wine glasses. Dylan kicked off his loafers, loosened his tie with a groan, and collapsed on the couch like a man who'd just conquered the world. "Babe, come sit with me. You've been running around like crazy all night." I did, mostly because my legs still felt too unsteady to carry me anywhere else. I perched on the edge of the cushion while he stretched out, propped his feet on the coffee table. He gave me that lazy, satisfied grin. "So, what's the big secret? You were killing me earlier." My breath caught. For a split second, I almost blurted it out. "About the baby. About how everything could have been different if only he hadn't already traded our future for someone else's bed." But then I pictured him on the phone, his low conspiratorial tone, calling me predictable. Sweet. Soft. Like I was an old sweater he planned to donate when it stopped fitting. I forced a faint smile. "I'll tell you tomorrow. I'm exhausted." A tiny crease formed between his brows. Disappointment, probably, though it vanished as quickly as it came. He shrugged. "All right. I'll just have to be patient." He stood, stretched again, then padded down the hall to our bedroom, humming under his breath. Probably some mindless tune he'd heard on the radio. It sounded almost cheerful. I stayed on the couch, surrounded by the fading scent of birthday candles and roast pork, feeling like I was floating somewhere above my own life. Eventually I cleared the glasses, scraped half-eaten cake into the trash, loaded the dishwasher. I kept waiting for the tears to return, but they didn't. Maybe I'd already wrung myself dry. When I finally went to bed, Dylan was already asleep, one arm flung across my side of the mattress like he still expected me to tuck in beside him. I lay down stiffly, facing the opposite wall, counting the faint lines in the plaster until my eyes burned. It hit me then. How many nights had he lain right here next to me, heart busy plotting an exit, mind tangled up in Nicole's perfume and promises? How long had I been loving a man who'd already set me aside? In the dark, my hand drifted to my stomach. The tiniest swell, invisible to anyone but me. I whispered so softly it barely reached my own ears. It's just us, little one. It might always be just us. Somehow, that thought didn't terrify me the way I expected. It anchored me. Because for the first time in days, maybe weeks, I felt a small spark of something almost like clarity. Tomorrow, I'd start figuring out exactly what my next step looked like. But tonight, I let my breathing slow, eyes heavy, one palm resting protectively over the life growing quietly inside me. And that was enough to get me through till morning. Stick around, because the morning, that's when everything started to change. The next morning started deceptively ordinary. Dylan was up before me, rummaging through dresser drawers for his running shorts, humming off-key to some pop song that always played in the background of the grocery store. I watched him from the bed, head heavy on the pillow, marveling at how seamlessly someone could wear two lives. He caught me staring and smiled. His hair stuck up in messy little tufts, eyes still puffy from sleep. "You're up early," he said, tugging on a faded UO duck sweatshirt. I shrugged. Couldn't sleep. He leaned down, pressed a quick kiss to my forehead. I flinched so slightly he probably didn't notice. Or maybe he chose not to. "Try to relax today," he said, as if I were the one carrying secrets heavy enough to split a ribcage. Then he slipped in his earbuds and headed out the front door. I listened to it click shut behind him. I lay there a long minute, staring at the faint water stain on the ceiling. Funny how you live with something broken so long it starts to blend in. Then I got up, pulled on sweatpants and an old gray tee with a tiny hole near the collar, and padded barefoot into the kitchen. The house was too quiet. Even the usual creak of the porch settling seemed to pause, waiting. That's when the first thought rose up, clear and cold. Check his phone. I'd never snooped before. Not once in 8 years. I wore that restraint like a badge of honor, proof of what a trusting wife I was. Maybe I thought it made me better than the women who peeked into pockets and scrolled through messages behind locked bathroom doors. Turns out, it just made me easier to fool. His phone sat on the counter next to his keys, charging. The screen was dark. I picked it up, hands trembling so badly I nearly dropped it. The lock screen glowed to life, demanding 4 little digits. Our anniversary. Of course. He hadn't even bothered to change it. That almost hurt more than if he had. I typed it in, and just like that, the door swung wide. The first few screens were innocuous enough. A sports headline. A weather alert. But then I opened his messages. Near the top was a thread with a contact listed only by a phone number, no name. My stomach pitched, like the ground had tilted beneath me. I clicked it open. The texts were relentless. Missed you all night. Can't wait till it's just us. I hate pretending. When can we finally stop? Attached were pictures. One of Nicole, of course it was her, laughing over a glass of wine, a tiny gold pendant glinting at her throat. Another of them together at a sleek bar I didn't recognize, heads tipped close, his hand on her knee. But it was the last photo that hollowed me out completely. It was of our back patio. The string lights I'd hung last summer for our anniversary dinner twinkled faintly above them. Nicole sat curled into Dylan's side on our wicker love seat, her shoes kicked off, wine glass resting on her thigh. They were living their secret right in the middle of my life. I dropped the phone onto the counter like it had burned me. My breath came in shallow little gasps. I staggered to the sink, gripping its edge, the cool porcelain grounding me just enough to stay upright. Then I ran. Not out of the house, I was too shattered to flee. Instead, I bolted to the bathroom, fell to my knees on the cold tile, and retched until there was nothing left. I'm sure someone would call it morning sickness. But I knew better. This was betrayal, pure and simple, clawing its way out of my body. When it was over, I sat back against the cabinet, knees pulled to my chest, tears leaking silently down my face. I rocked there for what felt like hours, whispering nonsense to myself. How many nights had he come home to me, kissed my hair, tangled his legs with mine in bed, all while dreaming of her? How long had I smiled at him across dinner plates, passed him salt and pepper, folded his laundry with careful hands, without seeing the stranger he'd already become? Do you think there's a point where love actually makes us blind? Or is it that we see everything, but we keep blinking it away because the truth feels like too much to survive? Eventually I pulled myself up, washed my face with cold water until the redness faded, then stumbled back into the hallway. I passed the mirror by the entryway without daring to look. I couldn't stand the idea of meeting my own eyes. Somewhere in the distance, a neighbor's lawn mower buzzed to life, and birds chattered in the maples. The world was blissfully unaware that mine had just been sliced clean in two. And tucked inside me, impossibly small but already fierce, was a life that deserved so much more than the lies we'd been living. That was the moment something subtle but enormous shifted in me. I didn't know exactly what I'd do yet, or how I'd find the strength. But I knew one thing with sharp, painful clarity. This wasn't just about me anymore. And that meant Dylan's carefully constructed double life? It was about to come crumbling down. I didn't want to face it alone. Not really. As much as my pride bristled at the thought of showing anyone just how gutted I felt, I couldn't carry this weight by myself. So I did what most people do when the world cracks open. I reached for the one person who'd always stood in my corner. Jamie. She and I had been inseparable since undergrad. She taught high school English now, wore her dark hair in a perpetually messy knot, and had a laugh that somehow made every miserable thing feel a little less sharp. I texted her with trembling fingers. Just 5 words. Can we meet today? It's important. Her reply came back so quickly it nearly made me cry. Of course. Same place, 11? By same place, she meant Fable, this tiny cafe on the corner of Hawthorne and 33rd. The place hadn't changed in years. Same mismatched chairs. Same cracked teal tiles by the pastry case. Same cheerful barista with a nose ring who always remembered Jamie's oat milk latte. I got there early and snagged our usual booth by the window. The table was wobbly, so I shoved a folded napkin under one leg. My hands were restless, smoothing and re-smoothing the corner of a menu I didn't bother reading. When Jamie walked in, she spotted me instantly. Her face went soft in that way that told me I looked worse than I thought. She shrugged out of her denim jacket and slid into the seat across from me. Grace, she breathed, reaching for my hand across the chipped wood. Jesus. What happened? I opened my mouth, then closed it again. For a second I was scared the words might not come out at all. That I'd start sobbing right there over the sugar caddy and tiny vase of wilting daisies. But somehow they poured out. All of it. The overheard phone call. The texts and pictures on his phone. Nicole laughing on my patio. My hand on my stomach while I realized Dylan was planning to leave before he ever knew about the baby. Jamie didn't interrupt. Just squeezed my hand so tightly my fingers went numb. Her jaw worked, like she was biting down on the urge to shout. When I finally finished, voice cracked and small, she let out a breath that was half laugh, half growl. That absolute piece of shit, she hissed. And for the first time in days, I actually laughed. A broken, startled sound that almost hurt coming out. You always did have a way with words, I said, wiping under my eyes. Jamie shook her head, her dark brows knitting together. I'm serious. How long, Gracie? How long have you felt something was off? I picked at the corner of a coaster until it shredded under my nails. Probably longer than I want to admit. But I kept. I don't know. Blaming stress. Telling myself we were just in a rough patch. Because it was easier than facing the truth. Isn't that terrifying? How willing we are to accept tiny fractures, just so we don't have to rebuild from rubble. Jamie blew out a slow breath. Listen. You're gonna get through this. And you're not doing it alone. I don't care if I have to move into your guest room for a month and scare off raccoons and cheating husbands alike. That image made me smile for real. When the server brought over our drinks, an iced chai for me that sweat little rings onto the table, I realized my hands had stopped shaking. Just a little. Jamie waited a beat, then asked it as gently as anyone could. So, what about the baby? I laid my palm over my stomach, feeling the tiniest flutter of protectiveness that surprised me with its force. I'm keeping it. No matter what happens with Dylan. This little one is mine. Jamie's eyes filled, though she blinked them clear. Good. That's really, really good. And when you're ready to see a lawyer, I know someone through my union rep. He's tough but kind. Like a golden retriever that does divorce law. I actually snorted. Leave it to Jamie to find the absurd in the bleakest places. We sat there a long time, cups empty, plates cleared, the cafe cycling through its usual playlist of indie folk songs. The midday sun slid through the dusty windows, catching on little motes in the air that danced between us. Eventually we stood, hugged so tight my ribs ached, and promised to talk that night. As I walked back to my car, I realized something that felt almost shocking. I wasn't as alone as I'd feared. Later that afternoon, back at home, I opened the hall closet and pulled out the small stack of folders we kept for important papers. Insurance stuff. Wills. And yes, our mortgage and marriage license. My hands paused on the edge of that last one. I ran a thumb over our names, the date embossed in fancy silver script. It looked like it belonged to strangers now. I tucked it back, but not before feeling a spark of steel somewhere deep in my gut. Dylan didn't know it yet, but the woman he'd underestimated, the one he thought would just roll over and cry forever? She was starting to get her feet back under her. And the next time we talked about forever, it wouldn't be his version. It would be mine. Stay with me. Because what happened that evening, when Dylan came home, sweaty and flushed from his run, humming like nothing had changed, was the beginning of the end. And maybe, just maybe, the start of something better. I didn't want to face it alone. Not really. As much as my pride bristled at the thought of showing anyone just how gutted I felt, I couldn't carry this weight by myself. So I did what most people do when the world cracks open. I reached for the one person who'd always stood in my corner. Jamie. She and I had been inseparable since undergrad. She taught high school English now, wore her dark hair in a perpetually messy knot, and had a laugh that somehow made every miserable thing feel a little less sharp. I texted her with trembling fingers. Just 5 words. Can we meet today? It's important. Her reply came back so quickly it nearly made me cry. Of course. Same place, 11? By same place, she meant Fable, this tiny cafe on the corner of Hawthorne and 33rd. The place hadn't changed in years. Same mismatched chairs. Same cracked teal tiles by the pastry case. Same cheerful barista with a nose ring who always remembered Jamie's oat milk latte. I got there early and snagged our usual booth by the window. The table was wobbly, so I shoved a folded napkin under one leg. My hands were restless, smoothing and re-smoothing the corner of a menu I didn't bother reading. When Jamie walked in, she spotted me instantly. Her face went soft in that way that told me I looked worse than I thought. She shrugged out of her denim jacket and slid into the seat across from me. Grace, she breathed, reaching for my hand across the chipped wood. Jesus. what happened? I opened my mouth, then closed it again. For a second I was scared the words might not come out at all. That I'd start sobbing right there over the sugar caddy and tiny vase of wilting daisies. But somehow they poured out. All of it. The overheard phone call. The texts and pictures on his phone. Nicole laughing on my patio. My hand on my stomach while I realized Dylan was planning to leave before he ever knew about the baby. Jamie didn't interrupt. Just squeezed my hand so tightly my fingers went numb. Her jaw worked, like she was biting down on the urge to shout. When I finally finished, voice cracked and small, she let out a breath that was half laugh, half growl. "That absolute piece of shit," she hissed. And for the first time in days, I actually laughed. A broken, startled sound that almost hurt coming out. "You always did have a way with words," I said, wiping under my eyes. Jamie shook her head, her dark brows knitting together. "I'm serious." "How long, Gracie? How long have you felt something was off?" I picked at the corner of a coaster until it shredded under my nails. Probably longer than I want to admit. But I kept. I don't know. Blaming stress. Telling myself we were just in a rough patch. Because it was easier than facing the truth. Isn't that terrifying? How willing we are to accept tiny fractures, just so we don't have to rebuild from rubble. Jamie blew out a slow breath. "Listen. You're gonna get through this. And you're not doing it alone. I don't care if I have to move into your guest room for a month and scare off raccoons and cheating husbands alike." That image made me smile for real. When the server brought over our drinks, an iced chai for me that sweat little rings onto the table, I realized my hands had stopped shaking. Just a little. Jamie waited a beat, then asked it as gently as anyone could. "So, what about the baby?" I laid my palm over my stomach, feeling the tiniest flutter of protectiveness that surprised me with its force. "I'm keeping it. No matter what happens with Dylan. This little one is mine." Jamie's eyes filled, though she blinked them clear. "Good. That's really, really good. And when you're ready to see a lawyer, I know someone through my union rep. He's tough but kind. Like a golden retriever that does divorce law." I actually snorted. Leave it to Jamie to find the absurd in the bleakest places. We sat there a long time, cups empty, plates cleared, the cafe cycling through its usual playlist of indie folk songs. The midday sun slid through the dusty windows, catching on little motes in the air that danced between us. Eventually we stood, hugged so tight my ribs ached, and promised to talk that night. As I walked back to my car, I realized something that felt almost shocking. I wasn't as alone as I'd feared. Later that afternoon, back at home, I opened the hall closet and pulled out the small stack of folders we kept for important papers. Insurance stuff. Wills. And yes, our mortgage and marriage license. My hands paused on the edge of that last one. I ran a thumb over our names, the date embossed in fancy silver script. It looked like it belonged to strangers now. I tucked it back, but not before feeling a spark of steel somewhere deep in my gut. Dylan didn't know it yet, but the woman he'd underestimated, the one he thought would just roll over and cry forever? She was starting to get her feet back under her. And the next time we talked about forever, it wouldn't be his version. It would be mine. Stay with me. Because what happened that evening, when Dylan came home, sweaty and flushed from his run, humming like nothing had changed, was the beginning of the end. And maybe, just maybe, the start of something better. I don't know how long we sat there, Dylan and I, perched on opposite ends of the couch like two awkward strangers waiting for the same bus. He wouldn't quite meet my eyes. Instead he picked at a loose thread on the cushion, rolling it between his thumb and forefinger as though it might unravel the whole fabric if he just kept at it. Eventually I broke the silence. "Do you love her?" It came out softer than I expected. Almost curious, like I was asking whether he preferred blueberry or apple pie. Dylan let out a long breath. Closed his eyes for a second. When they opened again, they were damp. "Yeah," he whispered. "I do." A tiny laugh slipped out of me. It wasn't amused. More like a startled hiccup that carried every brittle thing left in me. Wow, I said. Okay. Because what else was there to say to that? He loved her. This wasn't some fling he could apologize away with a dozen grocery store bouquets and a few half-sincere tears. I studied him, really studied him, in that small pool of lamplight. The lines by his eyes seemed deeper. His shoulders a little more sloped than I remembered. It struck me that love had blinded me to so many of his rough edges. Maybe that was what love did. Or maybe that was what my need for love did. Either way, I wouldn't let it blind me anymore. Then I dropped the final weight between us. I'm pregnant, I said, voice steady. His head snapped up so quickly I thought he might pull something in his neck. What? I held his gaze. Didn't flinch, didn't look away. I found out the morning of your mom's party. The morning you were planning your exit behind my back. For a second, pure shock washed across his face. His mouth opened, closed, then opened again like he was trying to catch words that kept darting away. Grace. Jesus. That changes everything. I almost smiled at that. It was tragic how predictable he still managed to be. No, I said quietly. It doesn't. He shook his head, leaned forward, elbows on his knees. Of course it does. We'll figure this out. Maybe we went too fast, me and Nicole. Maybe we can pause things. I mean, a baby, that's huge. It's ours. I let out a breath that was more relief than grief. Because hearing that? It made my choice even clearer. I'm keeping this baby, I told him. But I'm not keeping you. I'm filing for divorce tomorrow. He jerked back like I'd slapped him. His eyes darted around the room, landing everywhere except on me. You're serious? As a heart attack. And strangely, I felt lighter. Like saying it out loud cleared space in my lungs I didn't even know was crowded. Dylan's mouth opened again, then closed. Finally he just dropped his face into his hands. His shoulders started to shake, but whether it was anger or sorrow, I couldn't quite tell. Isn't it strange how someone can look so small when the power you've been giving them is suddenly cut off? I stood, smoothing invisible wrinkles from my jeans, then rested a hand on my belly. It wasn't showing yet, not really, but I still felt a protective rush every time I touched it. You made your choice, Dylan, I said softly. This is mine. He didn't argue. Maybe he knew he couldn't. Maybe he finally realized that the woman he'd dismissed as soft and predictable was standing right here, tougher than he ever gave her credit for. The rest of the night passed like a dream I couldn't quite wake from. Dylan gathered up a duffel bag with a few shirts, a pair of jeans, his toothbrush. Said he'd come back for the rest when things were less tense. I didn't argue. Didn't scream. Didn't throw anything or sob into the doorway begging him to stay. Because the truth was, by the time he pulled out of the driveway, tires crunching over our cracked concrete, I was already living in a different world than the one he was driving away from. I locked the door behind him, then leaned against it for a moment, feeling the solid wood cool against my spine. Somewhere down the street, a neighbor's porch light clicked on. The distant sound of a dog barking drifted through the evening air. Inside, the house was still, except for the faint hum of the fridge. It was done. And strangely, in that quiet, I felt something almost like hope bloom in my chest. Because for the first time in a long time, my life was truly mine again. Broken, yes. Scary and uncertain, absolutely. But mine. Stay close. Because tomorrow, when I walked into that lawyer's office with my head held high and my hands resting protectively over this tiny spark of new life inside me, I took the first real step toward a future I could finally call my own. The next morning, I woke before dawn. It wasn't nerves exactly. More like my body had decided on its own that today couldn't wait. I lay there for a moment, staring at the faint glow creeping in around the bedroom curtains. The sheets beside me were still rumpled from where Dylan had slept the night before, though the pillow carried only the soft scent of laundry detergent now. That, strangely, felt like a relief. I sat up slowly, pressing a hand to my belly. Just a tiny curve under my pajama shirt, barely there. Still, it was enough. Enough to remind me that what I did next was for both of us. I showered, pulling on a simple navy dress that cinched right above my waist, one I'd worn to office meetings countless times. I stood at the mirror afterward, smoothing my hands over my hair, trying to see if I still looked like myself. My reflection seemed sharper somehow. Less fragile. I made a quick breakfast, toast with raspberry jam and half a banana, more out of ritual than hunger. The house was quiet in that tender way early mornings always are. A few birds chattered in the maple outside the kitchen window. Somewhere down the block, I could hear a garbage truck making its slow rumbling crawl. By 8 o'clock, I was parked outside a squat brick building downtown that housed Harrow and Price, attorneys at law. The brass plaque by the door shone a little too brightly in the gray morning light. I sat there for a minute, engine idling, hands gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles ached. Funny how a door can look so ordinary and still feel like it's guarding the next chapter of your life. When I finally walked in, the receptionist greeted me with a warm, practiced smile. Her name tag said Malia. She had curly auburn hair pinned back with tiny gold clips and wore cheerful green glasses that made her look like a friendlier version of a librarian. Hi there. You must be Grace Palmer. Please have a seat. Michael will be right with you. Her voice was so gentle I almost cried. It's strange how kindness from strangers can cut deeper than cruelty from people you love. Michael Harrow emerged 10 minutes later. Mid-50s, bald at the crown, with a neatly trimmed salt and pepper beard. He shook my hand firmly, his palm dry and reassuring. Grace. Come on back. Let's talk through this together. His office smelled faintly of coffee and old paper, the kind of scent that felt solid, like it had roots. Law books lined 2 walls, interrupted by framed photos, grandkids at soccer games, someone holding a fishing pole with a trout the length of my forearm. He gestured for me to sit in a leather chair that squeaked under me as I settled. Then he folded his hands on his desk. So. Tell me everything. Start wherever you need to. And I did. I told him about Dylan. About Nicole. About the phone calls, the texts, the night I'd sat at our dining table while he lied straight into my eyes. About the baby. I didn't realize I was gripping the arms of the chair so tightly until he reached across and gently tapped my knuckles. You're stronger than you think, Grace. Really. And I'll be honest with you. You're in a good position here. You have clear evidence of the affair. You're pregnant. Oregon courts take these things seriously. A tiny breath I hadn't known I was holding escaped me. Michael laid out the options calmly. Divorce filings. Custody. How Dylan would likely be responsible for support. That I could stay in the house while everything was sorted. He gave me timelines, typical scenarios. Not sugar-coated, but not a horror story either. When he finished, he leaned back in his chair, steepled his fingers. Bottom line, Grace. You have choices here. And you have rights. Dylan doesn't get to decide the shape of your life going forward. You do. Something about hearing that, plain, unvarnished, settled a new weight in my chest. Heavy, yes, but solid. When I left the office an hour later, clutching a small folder of paperwork to my chest, the street seemed brighter somehow. A food cart on the corner was frying onions, the scent drifting sweet and savory through the damp air. Across the way, a florist was unloading buckets of sunflowers so large they looked almost comical. It struck me then how absurd it was that the world just keeps spinning. That people still buy coffee and joke with cashiers and rush to catch crosswalk signals while someone else's entire future is breaking and reassembling a few steps away. I went straight from there to my OB's office for a follow-up. The nurse was gentle, her hands warm on my wrist as she took my pulse. 6 weeks, the doctor said after reviewing the ultrasound. Everything looks perfectly healthy. I'll have Margot up front give you some prenatal samples. Make sure you're taking folic acid, staying hydrated. As she spoke, she handed me a tiny printout from the scan. Just a grainy swirl of gray and white that didn't look like much yet. But it was mine. Ours. I sat in my car afterward with that photo in my hand, tracing the edges with my thumb. You're the reason I'm doing this, I whispered. And I promise, we're going to be okay. Because despite everything, despite the sharp, fresh ache of betrayal still lodged under my ribs, I felt something else bubbling up. A sense of power. Of direction. I didn't know exactly what life would look like 6 months from now. A year from now. But for the first time in too long, I believed it could be something I'd built on my own terms. Stick around. Because later that afternoon, when I walked into my boss's office to share what was happening, I realized I wasn't just surviving this, I was starting to shape it. And that changed everything. By the time I pulled into the parking lot at work, it was nearly 2 in the afternoon. My hand still clutched the little ultrasound printout, edges soft from where I'd been rubbing it with my thumb all day. The building was quiet for a weekday, probably half the staff out grabbing late lunches. I walked past the receptionist's desk, gave her a small smile I hoped looked normal, and headed straight to Linda Carlson's office. Linda was my manager, the kind of woman who could juggle 10 client calls at once while simultaneously tracking the budget in her head down to the last decimal. She was maybe 50, with shoulder-length silver blonde hair she always twisted into a sleek clip, and a wardrobe full of jewel-toned blazers that made her look like she owned the whole damn block. Today she wore teal, a mug of herbal tea balanced on top of a stack of expense reports. When I knocked, she looked up over her reading glasses. "Grace, come in. You look, well, like you've had a day. Everything okay?" I sat across from her and tried to gather my words. I hadn't rehearsed it, though maybe I should have. Actually, I wanted to give you a heads up. I'm going through a divorce. And also, I'm pregnant. Linda blinked once, then carefully set down her tea. Her expression didn't shift much. She'd spent decades perfecting the calm, neutral manager face, but her eyes softened. "Oh, Grace." She reached across her desk and gave my hand a quick squeeze. "I'm so sorry. Are you all right?" "I will be," I said. The words surprised me. I realized I meant them. She nodded slowly. "Thank you for trusting me with this. Don't worry about the work side. We'll get through whatever you need. When you're ready to sort out maternity leave, we'll make it as smooth as possible." Relief poured through me. I hadn't realized how badly I needed someone to simply nod and say we'll handle it. Afterward, I ducked into the bathroom just to take a minute for myself. Under the bright fluorescent lights, I splashed water on my face and studied my reflection. My eyes still carried a tired, bruised look around the edges, but there was also something new there. A quiet determination that felt steadier than hope. You ever notice that? How sometimes, after the worst of it, your face starts to look a little stronger. Like your own bones are holding you up in a way they never did before. When I finally got home that evening, the house was too still. The sun had dipped low enough to spill peach and lavender across the kitchen walls. I set my bag down, changed into leggings and an old gray sweatshirt, then did something I hadn't done in weeks. I pulled out a recipe book. It wasn't about making some fancy dinner. I just needed to do something with my hands that reminded me I was still here, still capable of building small good things. I chopped onions and garlic, sautéed them slowly until the kitchen smelled warm and sweet. I added lentils, a splash of white wine left over from a party months ago, poured in broth. As it simmered, I stood by the stove, one hand resting absent-mindedly on my stomach. Later that night, Jamie came over. She didn't even knock, just breezed in carrying 2 paper bags from the bakery on 5th Avenue. Inside was a big crusty loaf studded with rosemary and sea salt, plus a wedge of berry pie she claimed we absolutely needed. She wrinkled her nose dramatically as she peeked into my pot. "Lentil stew. Look at you, healthy and domestic." I laughed. A real one this time. We ate at the counter, dipping hunks of bread into steaming bowls, the tang of tomatoes and garlic cutting through the heaviness. Jamie kept up a cheerful stream of nonsense, updates on a new teacher at her school who apparently wore sweater vests even in August, gossip about our old college roommate who'd moved to Arizona to find herself and instead found a cactus farm. At one point she grew serious, tapping her spoon against the rim of her bowl. "You know, Gracie, you're doing so damn well. I don't think you see it yet, but I do." I didn't answer right away. I just gave her a small, grateful smile. Because isn't that what real friends do? Hold up a mirror so you can finally see the strength they've been watching bloom all along. After Jamie left, I rinsed the dishes, wiped down the counters. I lit a single candle on the coffee table, the one in the little ceramic holder shaped like a tiny fox. Then I curled up on the couch with a book I never quite read, eyes growing heavy as the flame flickered. My phone buzzed once on the cushion beside me. A message from Dylan. "Can we talk? I miss you." I stared at it for a long while, thumb hovering over the screen. I felt a dull ache, sure, but also something close to pity. Because he didn't miss me. He missed who I used to be. The woman who never questioned, never demanded more, who kept the house cheerful and the conversation easy, who folded herself down so small that his life could stretch out comfortably in all directions. And she was gone. I clicked the screen off, set the phone face down on the table. Then I leaned back into the couch, one hand on my belly, feeling a slow warmth build there that had nothing to do with stew. Stick around. Because tomorrow, when Dylan showed up at my door unannounced, hoping for old patterns to save him, he was in for the coldest surprise of his life. The first time I heard my daughter cry, everything else fell away. The stale hospital air, the beeping monitors, the low chatter of nurses in the hall. None of it mattered. All I could hear was that tiny, insistent wail that meant she was here, she was real, she was mine. They placed her on my chest, slick and warm, fists balled up tight under her chin. She made this surprised little hiccup, then settled against me with a shaky sigh. I pressed my lips to her damp forehead and whispered, "Hi baby. It's us now. Just us." I named her Maeve Eleanor. Maeve because it means she who brings joy, which felt right for a girl who arrived after so much heartache. Eleanor for my grandmother, who'd once told me over cups of honey tea that the women in our family were made of quieter steel than most people could ever see. When Jamie came to visit us at the hospital, she brought a bouquet of coral ranunculus that looked like tiny fireworks exploding from their stems, plus a thermos of mushroom soup from that little deli on Alberta we used to swear had healing powers. "You did it, Gracie," she said, her eyes full as she tucked a stray hair behind my ear. "Look at you. Look at her." I wanted to laugh. Or cry. Or both. Because if someone had told me a year ago I'd be sitting in a scratchy hospital gown, cradling a brand new person, feeling more complete than I ever did playing house with Dylan, I would have called them delusional. Isn't that something? How life rips you open in ways you swear you'll never survive, only to fill you back up with things you couldn't have imagined wanting. After a couple of days under the gentle tyranny of round-the-clock checks, Maeve and I went home. My parents came to stay for the first week. My mom bustled around the kitchen making casseroles that could have fed a small army, while my dad hovered awkwardly near the bassinet like he wasn't sure if he was allowed to breathe too close. At night, when Maeve refused to settle, I'd pace the hallway with her tucked against my shoulder, whispering half-remembered lullabies. Sometimes I'd catch our reflection in the dark window and feel a little stunned. Who was this woman with the tired eyes and faint smile, rocking a baby at 3 in the morning like it was the most natural thing in the world? Turns out it was me. A month later, after my parents returned to Medford, I spent an afternoon sorting through boxes in the garage. I found an old framed photo from our wedding, stuck behind a stack of holiday decor. Dylan and I were standing on a dock at Lake Crescent, wind whipping my veil around our faces. We looked so happy. So sure. I held it for a long moment, then wrapped it gently in newspaper and packed it away. I didn't have it in me to throw it out completely. Not yet. But it didn't belong on my walls anymore. In its place, I hung a little canvas print I'd bought online in a sleep-deprived haze one night. Soft blush pink with the words "You are enough" written in looping gold script. It seemed cheesy when I ordered it. Now it felt like a promise I wanted Maeve to grow up reading every day. Because more than anything, I want her to know she doesn't have to shrink herself or perform or cling to someone who only loves the easy parts of her. She's enough. Exactly as she is. Funny thing is, that's a truth I didn't start believing for myself until she arrived. A few weeks ago, I walked into that same cafe where I once broke down in front of Jamie, only this time with Maeve strapped snug against my chest in a little olive green carrier. The barista, the same one with the gold hoop in her nose, cooed over her tiny feet. "You look good," she said. "Tired, but good." I laughed, adjusting the strap digging into my shoulder. That's probably the best compliment I could get right now. Because yeah, I was tired. Bone-deep tired in a way that no amount of caffeine could fix. But I was also alive in a way I hadn't been for years. Now, most evenings, I find myself curled on the couch with Maeve nestled against my chest, her breath warm and even. Sometimes I'll read aloud from whatever book is nearby. Sometimes I'll just sit there, the house finally still, and marvel at how far we've come. Dylan tried once more to wedge his way back in. Sent a letter with shaky handwriting, talking about wanting to know his daughter, about how he'd made mistakes but still hoped for a place in her life. I didn't reply. Maybe someday, for Maeve's sake, I'll figure out what kind of relationship, if any, makes sense. But for now, our world is small, safe, and enough. I'm not ready to invite his storms back in. You know, I used to think healing would look like waking up one day and feeling nothing at all. But that's not how it works. Healing is making soup while your heart still stings. It's rocking your baby to sleep while wondering if you'll ever trust so fully again, and deciding maybe you don't have to. It's realizing you're still tender and hopeful anyway. So that's where we are. Me and Maeve. Building something quiet and honest from the ground up. Tell me. Have you ever had to start over from absolute zero? Or wake up one morning and realize you were braver than you thought? I'd love to hear about it. Drop your story in the comments. And if you want to keep following these messy, real, beautiful days, hit subscribe. Because something tells me the best chapters are still ahead. And I'd really like to share them with you.